By the late 19th century, wealth in New York followed a strict visual language. Money mattered, but how it was displayed mattered more. Status was communicated through distance. Distance from the street, from neighbors, from noise, and from anyone who did not belong to the same social tier. The city's most powerful families did not simply live well, they lived apart. This separation shaped the urban landscape. Along Manhattan's most desirable avenues, private houses rose in long, orderly rows. Each one functioned as a self-contained world, staffed by servants and insulated from the public. Entryways were discreet. Windows were controlled. Even leisure was managed indoors. Apartments existed, but they occupied a very different position in the social hierarchy. For much of the 19th century, apartment living in New York was associated with necessity rather than choice. Immigrants, laborers, and people in transition lived in shared buildings because they had to. Even when apartments became larger and more refined, the association lingered. Sharing walls meant sharing space with people you could not control. For families at the top of society, this kind of proximity carried risk. As a result, apartment living remained socially ambiguous for the wealthy. It was tolerated in Europe, where dense cities had long normalized shared residences among elites. But in New York, a younger city still defining its identity, the private house was a symbol of arrival. To abandon it suggested compromise. This belief persisted even as the city changed around it. By the 1890s, Manhattan was under pressure. Population growth accelerated. Transportation improvements pushed development northward. Land values rose sharply, particularly near Central Park and along major avenues. Maintaining large private homes became increasingly expensive, not only in construction, but in daily operation. Servant labor was harder to manage. Space was harder to secure. Yet social expectations lagged behind economic reality. Many wealthy families faced a contradiction. Urban life demanded efficiency, but elite culture demanded isolation. Apartments offered solutions to practical problems, but they threatened symbolic ones. Living together, no matter how luxurious the conditions, still felt like a step away from control. This tension created an opening. Developers began experimenting cautiously. Early luxury apartment houses borrowed visual cues from private residences. They emphasized privacy, separate entrances, and controlled layouts. The goal was reassurance. These buildings did not challenge elite norms openly. They attempted to adapt quietly to them. But not everyone believed discretion was the answer. Toward the end of the century, a different idea began to take shape, one that rejected subtlety entirely. Instead of minimizing the visibility of apartment living, this approach embraced it. If shared living could not escape scrutiny, then perhaps scrutiny itself could be transformed into an advantage. The logic was simple, if risky. If an apartment building could be made grand enough, prominent enough, and impressive enough, it might reverse the direction of judgment. Rather than appearing as a compromise, it could present itself as an upgrade. Status would no longer come from separation, but from participation in something visibly exceptional. This was not a modest proposal. It required scale, it required confidence, and it required a willingness to challenge deeply ingrained assumptions about how wealth should look and behave. Most importantly, it required a building that could not be mistaken for anything ordinary. On Manhattan's Upper West Side, where development was accelerating but social rules were still unsettled, that idea found physical form. The site itself was ambitious. Broadway, cutting diagonally across the city grid, offered visibility unmatched by quieter residential streets. A building placed there would be seen, not just by neighbors, but by the city at large. Any structure rising on that corner would announce itself, whether it intended to or not. What followed was not an attempt to blend in. Plans emerged for a building so large and so ornate that comparison became difficult. It would occupy nearly an entire block. It would rise higher than its surroundings. Its facade would be layered with balconies, towers, and decorative stonework. Its roofline would be crowned with domes visible from a distance. But its ambition did not begin with architecture. It began with personality. William Earl Dodge Stokes was born into a world that valued discretion. His family name carried weight in business and society, the kind of weight that allowed its members to move quietly and still be heard. Many men in his position would have been content to preserve that standing. Stokes did not see money as something to be protected from attention. He saw it as a tool to command it. His real estate ventures reflected this philosophy. They were not modest investments designed to blend into their surroundings. They were statements, large, complicated, and difficult to ignore. The Ansonia would be his most ambitious statement. Unlike many developers of the era, Stokes did not remain at a distance from the projects he funded. He involved himself directly in design decisions, construction methods, and even mechanical systems. When work began on the Ansonia, he described himself as the project's architect-in-chief, a title that unsettled professionals but accurately reflected the degree of control he intended to exercise. Architects were hired, plans were drawn, and then plans were revised. Stokes traveled through Europe studying grand hotels and apartment houses, particularly those that housed elite families in dense urban settings. He was impressed by how aristocratic life abroad had adapted to shared living without losing its sense of hierarchy. But he did not want to replicate those buildings. He wanted to exceed them. In his view, New York required something bolder. European cities had centuries of tradition to legitimize collective living among elites. New York did not. If apartment living was going to succeed at the highest level, it would need to compensate for that lack of tradition through scale and spectacle. The building itself would have to perform the work that history had not yet done. This belief led to decisions that pushed the project far beyond conventional limits. Initial plans expanded repeatedly. Additional floors were added. Public spaces grew more elaborate. Systems were designed to operate at capacities rarely attempted in residential construction. Each change increased cost and complexity. Each change also reinforced Stokes's conviction that retreat would signal failure. Critics questioned the practicality of the vision. The Ansonia was not a single-purpose building. It was conceived as a hybrid, combining long-term residences with hotel-style services and amenities. This arrangement blurred familiar categories. Would residents feel at home in a building that also accommodated guests? Would the presence of shared staff and public spaces undermine the sense of control that elite households valued? Stokes believed these concerns misunderstood human behavior. A building of overwhelming scale changed the equation entirely. The Ansonia would not ask to be measured against townhouses. It would exist on its own terms. To achieve this, Stokes rejected moderation. Budgets escalated far beyond early estimates. Construction timelines stretched. Labor disputes slowed progress. At several points, the project appeared to be testing the limits of feasibility. Yet Stokes remained committed to the original premise. If the building failed, it would not be because it lacked ambition. If residents were surrounded by abundance, of space, of service, of ornament, they would internalize that abundance as security. The building's hybrid nature was central to this strategy. Long-term residents would enjoy the stability of home life. Hotel-style services would absorb the unpredictability of daily logistics. Staff would operate behind the scenes, maintaining order while allowing residents to move through the building without friction. This orchestration required careful planning, but it also required trust that people would adapt to a new way of living if the conditions felt sufficiently controlled. Not everyone shared that trust. Among New York's elite, The idea of sharing a building on such a scale remained unsettling. Privacy had long functioned as a marker of class. To dilute it, even in the name of convenience, felt risky. By the time the Ansonia neared completion, it had become clear that the project represented more than a business venture. It was a social wager, a belief that the habits of the wealthy could be redirected through architecture, infrastructure, and sheer magnitude. The Ansonia would need to prove that its internal life could sustain the confidence its exterior projected. The next question was how it would function once people moved in. If the Ansonia was meant to change how people felt about apartment living, architecture alone was not enough. Stone and ornament could project confidence, but daily experience would determine whether that confidence held. For Stokes, this meant the building had to function less like a collection of homes and more like a carefully engineered system. In this sense, the Ansonia was not just a residence, it was a machine. From the beginning, its internal infrastructure was designed to operate at a scale rarely attempted in residential construction. The building required enormous quantities of water, heat, power, and ventilation to support hundreds of residents and staff simultaneously. Rather than relying on municipal systems alone, the Ansonia incorporated many of these functions internally, giving it a degree of self-sufficiency unusual for its time. This approach served both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it allowed the building to maintain consistent conditions regardless of external fluctuations. Psychologically, it reinforced the idea that life inside the Ansonia was insulated from the uncertainties of the city beyond its walls. Plumbing alone represented a major undertaking. The building contained miles of piping to deliver hot, cold, and chilled water throughout its many floors. Bathrooms were plentiful by the standards of the era, a significant distinction in a city where shared facilities were still common in many buildings. This abundance of private amenities helped reduce one of the most persistent anxieties associated with apartment living: the loss of personal control. Heating and ventilation were treated with similar seriousness. Rather than relying on fireplaces or individual stoves, the Ansonia employed centralized systems designed to regulate temperature across the building. Air circulation was carefully planned to ensure that interior spaces remained livable even as the structure's density increased. These systems were not visible to residents, but their presence shaped daily life in subtle ways. Vertical movement posed another challenge. At a time when elevators were still gaining public trust, the Ansonia relied on them heavily. Multiple elevators served different functions, separating residents, staff, and goods wherever possible. This separation preserved a sense of order within the building and reduced the friction that might otherwise arise in shared spaces. Movement became efficient and discreet. Corridors were wide and deliberately laid out, emphasizing flow rather than compression. Staircases were substantial, not hidden or secondary. Light courts carved into the structure ensured that interior apartments received air and daylight, countering the claustrophobic associations many people still held about apartment houses. All of this required coordination. Staffing levels were significant. Maintenance was continuous. The building functioned through layers of labor that residents rarely encountered directly. This invisibility was essential. Luxury, as Stokes understood it, depended on effort being concealed. In effect, the Ansonia centralized the operations that private households once managed individually. Servants in townhouses handled heating, cleaning, deliveries, and repairs. At the Ansonia, these responsibilities were absorbed by infrastructure and staff operating at scale. By removing many of the daily rituals associated with maintaining a private home, the building altered the rhythms of elite life. Time previously spent managing property was freed. Movement through the city became easier. Hosting guests no longer required the same level of preparation. The building itself absorbed much of the logistical burden. The building's design also allowed for flexibility within apartments themselves. Units could be expanded or contracted by combining rooms, accommodating families of different sizes and changing needs. This adaptability reinforced the sense that living there did not require permanent sacrifice. Residents could adjust their space without leaving the building. Such flexibility further distinguished the Ansonia from earlier apartment houses. Whether residents would fully embrace that model remained an open question. Engineering could shape experience, but it could not eliminate human behavior. As people moved in and daily life took hold, the building would be tested in ways no blueprint could predict. For those who moved in, the experience was unlike anything New York had offered before. Apartments within the Ansonia were expansive by contemporary standards. Many contained multiple bedrooms, formal dining rooms, parlors, and libraries. Spaces designed to accommodate family life, entertaining, and domestic staff. Ceilings were high, walls were thick. Sound traveled less than expected, a detail that mattered greatly in a building of this size. Residents accustomed to private houses found familiar comforts inside their apartments, but the context around them was different. Instead of a single household occupying an entire structure, hundreds of lives unfolded within the same walls. The Ansonia also offered social infrastructure rarely found in private residences. Dining rooms, reception areas, and shared spaces allowed residents to host guests without leaving the building. Meals could be taken on site. Gatherings could be arranged with minimal preparation. Music and entertainment were integrated into the environment, lending the building a sense of ongoing activity. At the Ansonia, interaction became more fluid. Residents encountered one another in elevators, corridors, and shared spaces. Familiarity developed naturally. For some, this created a sense of community that felt modern and stimulating. Over time, this shaped the Ansonia's internal character. The resident population became diverse in background and routine. Families lived alongside artists. Long-term tenants shared space with temporary occupants. This mixture added vitality to the building, but it also introduced unpredictability. For some observers, this unpredictability felt energizing. The Ansonia seemed alive, constantly in motion, reflective of a city embracing modernity. As stories circulated about the kinds of people who lived there and the activities that took place inside, the building's reputation began to evolve. Some accounts emphasized its sophistication and comfort. Others focused on its liveliness, hinting at a looseness not typically associated with elite residences. Whether these impressions reflected reality or exaggeration mattered less than the fact that they existed. The Ansonia had become more than housing. It had become a symbol, a place where traditional boundaries softened and new forms of urban life took shape. To live there was to participate, knowingly or not, in a shift away from strict isolation toward managed proximity. This shift did not sit comfortably with everyone. As the building matured, its strengths and tensions became more visible. The systems that enabled flexibility also required constant oversight. The diversity that energized daily life also complicated management. The Ansonia was proving that shared luxury was possible, but it was also revealing the cost of sustaining it. The experiment was working, but it was not static. And as the city continued to change around it, the conditions that had allowed the Ansonia to flourish would come under increasing pressure. By the early decades of the 20th century, New York was changing rapidly. Social boundaries were shifting. Entertainment culture expanded. Regulations tightened and loosened in cycles. The city grew louder, faster, and more scrutinized. The Ansonia, by virtue of its scale and visibility, absorbed these changes more directly than most residential buildings. Its reputation began to evolve. What had once been described as bold and modern was increasingly described as unusual. Stories circulated about the kinds of residents who lived there and the activities that occurred within its walls. Some of these accounts were grounded in fact. Others were exaggerated or speculative, but together they shaped public perception. The Ansonia no longer felt neutral. For some observers, it had become emblematic of a looser, less regulated form of elite living. It housed families and individuals, long-term residents and short-term occupants, people whose lives followed predictable rhythms, and others whose schedules did not. Managing this diversity required constant oversight. Ownership and operational control shifted over time, introducing new priorities and pressures. Decisions about staffing, services, and maintenance were increasingly shaped by financial constraints rather than original vision. Some amenities were scaled back, others were restructured. The careful orchestration that had once defined the building grew more fragile. Legal and regulatory pressures added to this strain. As city oversight increased, large, multifunctional buildings like the Ansonia attracted scrutiny. Inspections became more frequent. Compliance requirements grew more complex. Any irregularity, real or perceived, was magnified by the building's profile. These pressures affected residents as well. Some families chose to leave, seeking environments that felt more predictable or aligned with traditional expectations. Others remained, drawn by the Ansonia's space and solidity despite its evolving reputation. The composition of the building continued to shift, reinforcing the sense that it was no longer anchored to a single social identity. Economic forces accelerated this transformation. Maintenance costs for a building of such size were substantial. The Ansonia's scale, once its greatest asset, became a liability in periods of uncertainty. Externally, the city offered alternatives. Newer residential buildings emerged with more streamlined operations and fewer complications. They promised modern comforts. As New York moved deeper into the 20th century, the city's relationship with luxury continued to evolve. The era that had produced monumental statements of wealth gave way to periods of austerity, efficiency, and reinvention. Buildings that could not adjust were demolished, subdivided, or forgotten. The Ansonia avoided this fate by changing form without abandoning its core presence. This transformation was neither quick nor graceful. Over time, the building passed through multiple phases of ownership and management. Each brought new strategies for coping with its scale and complexity. Some focused on maximizing revenue. Others emphasized preservation. Legal disputes and regulatory challenges continued to surface, reflecting the difficulty of managing a structure originally designed to operate as a small, self-contained city. Yet the Ansonia endured. Its physical qualities played a critical role in this survival. The building's thick masonry walls, generous floor plans, and durable construction gave it resilience that newer structures often lacked. While its systems aged, its bones remained strong. Apartments retained a sense of solidity increasingly rare in later developments. Gradually, the building's purpose shifted. The Ansonia transitioned away from its original hybrid model and moved toward more conventional residential use. Apartments were subdivided, reconfigured, and updated to meet changing expectations. Some of the elaborate services that had once defined daily life disappeared. Others were simplified or replaced. What remained was space. In a city where square footage grew ever more scarce, the Ansonia's large apartments became an asset once again. New generations of residents were drawn not by spectacle, but by proportion. The building offered room to live, to work, and to adapt, qualities that transcended fashion. Public perception followed this shift. The Ansonia was no longer judged primarily by how closely it matched its original ambition. Instead, it was understood as a landmark, an artifact of a particular moment in the city's development. Its ornate facade, once controversial, became a symbol of architectural confidence. Its scale, once unsettling, became part of its charm. Preservation efforts formalized this reassessment. As awareness of the building's historical significance grew, it gained protection. Landmark status acknowledged not just its architectural value, but its cultural role.